This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. My name is Angelica Solinska. I'm your host, and today I'm joined by Donna Mooney. Thank you very much, Donna, for joining. It's brilliant to have you. So we will be talking about the art of advocacy for children. So I'll firstly introduce Donna to kind of get an insight of why we're talking about this. So Donna is an early years specialist who's worked in a number of different roles within the early years field for over 25 years. And the roles have included teaching, early years consultancy and lecturing, both in the UK and in the USA. So I think it's important to really have a bit of a look at what advocacy actually is, because we'll be unpicking it, and it's important to ask the question of what do we mean by advocacy, because we've spoken about advocacy before on this podcast on a deeper level, but recently we've especially kind of heard this word a lot more in the current circumstances. But what do we actually mean by this? Do we know what it means? Do we know what it means in a range of contexts? So advocacy is defined as, in basic terms, public support for an idea, a plan, or a way of doing something. Now, this can be reflected in what's been happening recently in the UK in response to the mass stabbings and consequent xenophobic and particularly Islamophobic riots. In response to these riots, there have been protests advocating for anti-racism, where people have been publicly supporting the anti-racist movement. So that's a current example. And in education, we hear the term advocacy used quite a lot. So, for instance, on the Voice of Early Childhood, we talk about advocating for early childhood, for this sector, for children, for educators and families. And on a wider level, we mean standing up for what is right and what is deemed as best for early childhood. Now, obviously, we've all got different views of what do we mean as what is best. So here, for instance, we mean according to the needs of children, families and educators, and really led by their voices, informed by research and practice, and by child development. So we may all advocate for what we deem is the right thing to do. And I know, Donna, you talk about your own experience as an educator as well in struggling to advocate. So please tell us a little bit about this to really kind of set that scene of what do we mean by advocacy in education, and how might it sometimes can be quite difficult to do.
I think, I think having spent so long in early years, I've seen a wide variety of changes happen, which are often government led through policy. And I think, anyone who works with children in early years usually goes into that with the best intentions. They care about children. They want to make a difference. I mean, that was certainly my reason for kind of wanting to work with young children and to make a difference in their lives. And so, in my own experience, I found it quite difficult sometimes to ensure that I was doing that when I was kind of presented with policies that had to be implemented. And I knew that maybe they weren't necessarily good for children or the best for children. But because they were kind of being put forward by a higher body to some degree, I felt like I had to do it. And I think what happens to people in early years is they'll either implement it to a T, or they'll play the game and implement it around what they know is good for children, which is really difficult to do, I think, and we really shouldn't be doing that. But I think in my experience, I never kind of felt comfortable to push back on that. I never felt that I had the ability or the strength to do that. But obviously, in more recent years, I've had a personal experience not linked to early years, quite a traumatic experience linked to my family that led me into engaging in Parliament and policy in a different way. And I think it's kind of been quite enlightening, actually, and surprising how doing that and understanding that has allowed me to influence policy in a way, because I think you realise that actually I think more people could do it if they were aware of the procedures that are already available, actually, that would enable us to do that. And I think I didn't have any idea about those things prior to this experience. And so I think kind of sharing that experience and that knowledge is really key in allowing other people to maybe make those decisions, to engage in a different way, to advocate for children in a different way for things that we know are maybe good for them, to support that, and to push back on things that we know maybe aren't necessarily the best for children. We work on the ground with children day to day, and that is a really important experience. In fact, it's probably the most important experience in terms of decision making. And I often think that is completely ignored in those decisions. And those decisions are made by people who maybe haven't been on the ground for a long time, not quite as in touch as they should be, or maybe their agendas are different, or their focus is different. So I think it's quite. I'm almost on the flip side of where I was a few years ago when I was working with children, feeling like I couldn't do anything for them in terms of advocate for them in that way. I'd advocate for them, but in a very different way. Whereas I feel kind of now I have an insight into these processes, and I feel that more people, if they were aware of it, could probably do the same, and that would be maybe a stronger change in the right direction for children.
Yeah, and it's concerning that you say, and this is so true for so many people in the education sector now, and with my own experience as well, that we are just not equipped to advocate, to be confident to do that, or at least have the tools to do that and understand how we could do it. And there really needs to be something there in place for educators to be equipped with that, whether in training or within practice. And I guess this is the work that you're doing now that you have been equipped with that knowledge because of your own experiences and your own kind of inquiries into this. Now you are sharing ways in which people can advocate, and then that can obviously directly impact practitioners on the ground. So you speak about quite practical ways of advocating, don't you? And that's what you've written in your article. And it doesn't have to be necessarily big and scary, because that is something that, with advocacy and especially activism as well, which is kind of a little bit step further, it can be quite risky and unpleasant, with protests and things like that, like we mentioned earlier. So it doesn't always have to be that way. So do you have some practical examples that you can share?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, like you said, there's kind of like smaller things that people could do, or bigger things. And sometimes it might be that they start with those smaller things and it leads to big things, or maybe that's just enough. And I think the key is having your voice heard for the children that you're working with. So essentially you're allowing their voices to be heard. So, I think some of the key things, I think before anyone does anything, I think that, there's key things, and I talk about this in the article, there are key things that are really important to have in place prior to that. And one of the things is understanding, what you want changed, or, what's being presented to you, and maybe what the reasons why you are not comfortable with that. So being really clear on some of those goals and kind of expectations of what you want changed or what you don't want to happen, so that you're very clear on that. Because I think when you're approaching anyone or wanting change, it's really key that you're very clear on those things, to kind of having those goals. And an example of that might be, which is kind of ironic actually, with the things that are happening with Ofsted at the moment. An example might be that, having an Ofsted inspection that is maybe more nurturing and caring towards staff and children. So that, that might be the kind of bigger goal that you have. And then you might taper that down and look at kind of, okay, well, how would I get to that point? What would we want? Maybe we would want some more supportive coaching in place prior to Ofsted. So you've got steps to get that. So
and what
really,
does that actually look like? What you want? Yeah.
Yeah. So then when you are speaking to people, you're going to them not only with the problem, but you're going with a solution or steps to get.
That's so important.
Yeah, like, another aspect might be funding, looking at the, the funding that they're talking about for children, and that might be leaving some practitioners or settings at a funding deficit. So, if they are wanting to approach people to change that, what's being put forward to them, looking at steps to get to that. So it might be a breakdown of, okay, well, what does the funding look like for our 0 to 3s? What do we want changed for those guys? What do we want it changed for the under twos? So it's a kind of broken down step. So that's kind of the main thing, I think, is really understanding what the changes that you want, and also I think because if you're clear on that the passion will come with that. And I think in order to change, you need to be passionate and feel quite strongly about something, which I think most early years practitioners do. I think spent many years kind of pushing those things down and ignoring them, and it's okay to share those things. And then the other step is really understanding why you want that changed. You've got to have a really good rationale around that, and that will include personal experience, and which is really important. And I think we as early years educators, sometimes that's really undervalued. So having confidence to use that experience and sharing that. So the reasons why you want that change, so your experience. Also looking at data and research is really, really important. So looking at all of those things and pulling all of that together. And again, if I go back to kind of the funding example, it might be that you look at how looking at, you break down that kind of funding of kind of, well, how much do we need for one child who's on this age for for staffing, for resourcing, and you break that down, and you could then take that to the relevant people and say, well, look, this really isn't enough. It's enough for a child for this many hours, but not the hours you're suggesting. And this is the impact it will have. Look at these countries where they fund really well, and the outcomes for their children, and look at other countries maybe where that doesn't happen, or look in our experience where that hasn't happened, and being really clear on your rationale and why you're doing it. So, pulling all of that together, your knowledge, your experience, data, and any research, all of that is going to be really, really key, because people will, if you take that as a whole package to people, they're going to listen to it much more rather than just saying my opinion is. Or they'll be more open to that. And I think, when you've worked in early for long enough, what is right and what is wrong and what's good for children, what isn't. But you need to bring more to the table than just that when you're asking for change. So that's the other section. So obviously the goals, setting clear goals, understanding why you're doing that. And then the next part is when you are then looking at, okay, well, I would like these things to be changed. It's really important that you take those forward at a specific time. So looking at when is the best time to take these forward, and sometimes there won't be a good time, so you would just take those forward, but quite often there is a good time. And an example of that is right now with the new government. They're reviewing policies. They'll be sharing policies and asking for feedback. There'll be new people in posts who will be more open to hearing from people on the ground. So kind of looking at key points of when you take your changes to people. And so timing is really, really key. Other timings that you might find are things like when they're reviewing policies, or when there's consultations on things. The Education Select Committee, which is a group of MPs who meet in Parliament. They'll often do inquiries, and they'll ask for feedback from anyone, really, actually, the general public, earliest practitioners, and then organisations. And they're not always made that public, so it's kind of looking out for those kind of things and those times where you can submit evidence and flag kind of some of those changes that you want. And because if you've done all of that groundwork before, you'll have all of that information ready to go to share with those people. So timing is really, really key. But like I said, if there isn't a good time, then I would say don't wait, just carry on. But timing will you're likely to get a quicker change with the right time. So and then once you've kind of explored all of those things, the next point really is, and this is probably the biggest and most important step in all of this, is networking and building your community. And I think with any change that's ever happened in history, it's often not happened unless there has been a collective voice pushing forward with things. So I think, networking is really, really important. So kind of sharing those ideas and talking, about those ideas and that research and data that you might have, with people that you work with, as a sounding board, sharing them with other practitioners, with other organisations. And I think the other thing, which is really important, I think we often shy away from in early years, is it's also talking to those people who maybe oppose your views. Just speaking to them and asking them like what their opinions are and why they believe those things. And because I think in order for any of us to understand kind of why people are doing believe what they do, you're not going to get there unless you speak to them. So I think having those conversations with people around what their beliefs are and why they think it's important, and I think actually that will do one of two things, and I think it's usually the latter, but it'll either convince you that maybe what your views are, or maybe you might deviate from them, but that often doesn't happen. What it often does is it strengthens your view, and it makes you it reinforces why you believe that and why it's important. But I think in terms of any change, like that collaboration and those kind of conversations and networking are really, really important. And that could be on any scale. It might be that you have an inspector in and they're asking you about things, and it might be asking them about their views on certain things, like I don't know, times and how long children should be sitting for, or those kind of things. So it helps you to kind of gain a view on that, on their views. And so that's kind of, and I think through doing that networking outside of the people who maybe oppose your views, but with people that you kind of have similar views as, it will strengthen the push for change in specific areas. I think that is really, really key. I think bringing people together, being a voice, and that that when you look at early years, it doesn't necessarily just mean practitioners, and I think this is probably really important for any change. It's including the voice of parents too.
Yeah, definitely.
I think we all know that they're children's first and most important educators, and they will want what's best for their children, and often they don't always know the impact that some changes will have on their children. And so I think, kind of allowing parents to understand that and having those conversations, therefore it's kind of a collective voice. It's much more stronger in a push for change. And again, all of this isn't saying, everyone's going to go outside and protest, because in the work that I've done myself outside of this, I've never done that. And I think, there are processes in place that allow us to be the voice and advocate in a way where we don't have to do that. And so that kind of brings me into the next step is, well, what do you do with all of this? How do you take action? And I think, there are many different things. I think networking in itself is an action. You're sharing that kind of perspective and that voice and that experience, and that might, begin a kind of ripple effect. Other things that are available to us to do, and I think these are the points that are new to me, or that I wasn't aware of before, are things as simple as finding out who your local MP is and asking to go and speak to them. They have surgeries once a month where if you contact them, they will give you 10 minutes to go and speak to them about things that you want to speak to them about. And that is a really important route into getting change and advocating for children. So people kind of contacting the local MP, and you can go to those surgeries. You can also just email them and raise some of those concerns, or they sometimes will call you. But what I've realised is that MPs are very open to that, and actually they want to represent their constituents, which is people that live where in the area that they represent, and they will take your views to the relevant people in Parliament and share them. And so while that might not have an instant change, if that happens often for the same kind of topic or area, that will then can lead to the kind of it being a bigger conversation and potentially change, some change. So kind of having that's very kind of that's a really basic. Go and speak to the local MP, or it doesn't have to be a big. There are other things that people can do, but that's kind of a very basic, first step into it.
And I guess, like you say, is a first step. I guess some people might be thinking, it may not really bring about change because I'm just going for a 10-minute conversation that's not very long at all, or I don't really see this making any change. But like you say, it's that first step, but also if enough people do it, and like you say, on the same topic, then that will be heard louder, clearer, the issue will be raised, and it is all kind of in numbers, in that community building and networking, like you say. And on the topic of parents as well that you mentioned, parents are brilliant advocates for early childhood, like you said, because they want the best for their children. So of course they're going to advocate, and there are a lot of parents out there, lots of lots of people have children, and it's the best way of advocating. So it really is so important to build those relationships with parents, and also really communicate what is right for their children, and what you are as a setting or as educators are trying to change, implement, to advocate for, and bringing them on board, and not just keeping that separate.
100%. And I think also, I mean, often, and I only understand this now being a parent, actually, most parents don't know, aren't aware of kind of a lot of the things that their children are being asked to do because they're being asked to do. And an example of that is the new reception screening. When children come into reception now, they're being asked to do this test within the first few weeks. Most parents aren't aware really of kind of what that even means. And so, as a early as educator, if you're sharing that with parents and sharing with them, what that experience might be like for their child,
and the impacts and why,
and actually, giving them giving them the full kind of scope of kind of what that means and what that looks like, and also the reason behind why it's happening. Like, who is this for? I think more parents will become, are more engaged in this topic, I think, because they really aren't aware of these things that are happening and kind of the reasons behind, and so.
Yeah, and it's important to keep them informed, because they have the right to know what's happening in their children's lives, in their children's education. And it's actually David Meachin, who has been on the podcast before, speaks a lot about this. He wrote an article about this stemming from his research, exactly on what you just said. He talked about his own experience as a parent and trying to pull his child out from the reception baseline assessment, and he is also a lecturer in education, so he was very well equipped to kind of have those conversations and advocate, and he still kind of failed essentially in pulling this child out, and it's just such a complex kind of area to navigate, even for educators, let alone for parents. So it's important to really support them within that.
And like you said, sharing that information and really working with them as partners together, so that they fully understand kind of what, as educators, we're being asked to do. Also for them to understand, based on kind of our experience and knowledge and, training, and what is good for children and maybe what isn't good for children. And again, it goes back to that. The only way to get change is through a collective approach to, collaboration of that. And that has to, 100% has to involve parents, because they will push harder for their children than anybody else. And also because they're not restricted in the same way that we might be if we're working in schools or, settings. We could push probably to a certain point, but then, it's harder to continue that sometimes. So, having parents, that is really, really key, and, allowing them to understand those things. So, yeah, so, that kind of, it's the collaboration is really important. And I think also, it's quite difficult, I think, when you're asking for change and pushing for change. So not feeling like you're alone in doing that is really important too. So almost looking after yourself too. And, it reinforces knowing that you're doing the right thing. Because I think sometimes doing it as a solo person on your own, you can sometimes question that a bit more, even though that it is the right thing. As a collective, if there's a collective of people who feel the same way for the same reasons, or for varied reasons, and that makes it much easier.
Hi, it's Angelica here. Thank you all for listening in. I'm here to ask for a quick favour from the early years community. In order for the Voice of Early Childhood to continue creating free, valuable content and sharing voices, we need your help. Please hit the subscribe button wherever you are listening on. And if you are listening on a podcast platform, then check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can not only listen, but also watch the podcast and really focus in on the discussions. Or if you are viewing on YouTube already, remember that you can also find us on 19 different podcast platforms. Simply search for The Voice of Early Childhood and subscribe to get a brand new episode every Monday morning, ready for your morning commute or however you start your week. And as always, do share the podcast with colleagues, friends, and parents of young children. We have a lot of interested parents and family members listening in and reading the articles. So let's ensure more of them can access the free content. Let's encourage them to engage and keep these thought-provoking discussions going. Enjoy the rest of the episode. Yeah, it definitely makes it feel like you said you're not on your own and you can kind of carry on and plow on despite the setbacks as well, because it is challenging and, it's difficult hearing no or having closed doors or just keep pushing on. And then also what you mentioned earlier on the flip side, listening to people who have different views, because that will make you so much more informed. And I just think that's such a great point, because it really does open you up to being challenged and being ready to have that challenge, because that will happen. But also be able to understand the kind of the opposing view and why things are not the way that you feel like they should be happening, and then be able to, I guess, be a lot more well informed about the situation in terms of, I understand that this is the case and this is why it's happening now like this, but this is, what I propose, and it's kind of being seen as being very rational and really well equipped with all of the knowledge that you need. Like you were saying earlier, make sure that you set out exactly like your stance, your goals are clear, what you want to change. And I think what's really important there is making sure that we as the early years workforce are taken seriously, and we are being professional, and we're also being research evidence informed, having that data, like you said, and also using the right language as well. It's really hard a lot of the time in early years to kind of have our voices heard, because we are so different to the rest of education in terms of primary, secondary, further higher education. They use more of the same kind of language, whereas we're very much play-based. And even the word curriculum has only recently entered early years. So actually, I think, and Jan Dubiel talks about this a lot, having language really matters. And we need to, when we're having conversations with people that are outside of the sector, we do need to match their language and make sure that we're speaking their language in order to be understood, which actually is a lot of people are against, because it's like, well, we need to stay true to ourselves and use the language that we're using, and it's play-based and all these kinds of things. But if it's not making a change, then we need to switch, don't we?
Yeah, I think 100%. And I think, like you said, having conversations with people who maybe don't agree with you is really, really important. I think one, because of that, you then would enter into a meeting or conversation with somebody who would then come with, that kind of language or those kind of views, and it would maybe make you feel, at the very least, but maybe even impact the strength of kind of what you're asking for. So you do have to enter into the arena with people, and you do sometimes have to make change in your approach to things, in those conversations, in the language you use, and so on and so forth. Because I guess it comes back down to, and this is something that is really key, is what is the end goal? Is it what's best for the children, and advocating for them? So if we have to change our language in those conversations in order to get there, that's the process. That getting to that point is the key thing, and if that means that you have to do that. And I think that is something that I've definitely learned, that you have to put yourself in those uncomfortable positions sometimes, have those uncomfortable conversations, and feel out of your depth, in order to push further, but also to understand kind of the arena that you're in terms of looking for change. And I think actually by doing that, it brings another level of respect from from those people to you, because it's from the approach that's maybe been taken previously, or they're surprised. Because I think, sometimes, and this is probably definitely happened within early years. I think sometimes, there can be a lot of typical kind of opinions on, if you work in early years, then, and I think going into those conversations and having those conversations can sometimes surprise people and maybe make them stand up a little bit more. And I think this is the thing about kind of how we take action, engaging with Parliament in that way is very unusual in education itself, but definitely within early years. I mean, I never would have in a million years ever thought about doing that until my experience. But now I think, well, why wouldn't I? If something is happening to children that I don't think is good for them, why would I not do that? There's a process in place to help get change. It might not lead to anything to start with, but if that happens often enough, then essentially it will, or it might lead to conversations where they're reconsidering those things. And I think that's the key thing about when we talked about going to speak to your people's MPs. While that 10-minute conversation might not feel like it leads to anything, it might mean that your MP might go and speak to the Secretary of State for Education and say, I've had someone in my constituency speaking to me about this. I just wondered if we could have a conversation about it. And if you're leaving your kind of research and experience and those kind of things with them, they can take that forward and say, we've had someone come and speak to us about this and they have concerns. And again, if that happens often enough, there will be more conversations around that. Yeah. And I think, that is a very low level approach. I mean, there is more that people could do than that if they wanted to. And, other ways to do that would be for asking your MP to ask questions in Parliament around it, why, again, around the change that you want, that would then, raise conversations that's made public. You could also write to the Secretary of State yourself and ask for those changes to be considered, sending in your rationale. There is a Minister for Early Years now, and his name is Stephen Morgan. Contacting him, asking him, raising your concerns around those things. And again, it's all those kind of that drip feed of, these are our concerns, really interested to hear your perspective on this, my experience, his research, and so on and so forth. And so, it can kind of, all of those kind of actions can lead to change, and it can be as big, as small as you want. I mean, there are other things that people can do which would take it to another level, but it's not going out and protesting. It's not kind of, it's not going down that route. It's using the policies and the practices that are already kind of set out in Parliament that allow us to actually try and influence policy in some way. Other things are things like engaging with media, which I know a lot of people wouldn't want to do, but that is a route. And I think when you talk about when we talked about kind of networking and engaging with parents, I mean, the media would pick up on that very quickly if parents were feeling a particular way about certain things, certain policies, and Parliament are more likely to act then.
And parents, I was just going to quickly say, parents may be more likely to go and take things to media, because we as educators are all educators, but then the parents and children, families that are in our care have various different roles in various different sectors and experiences. They may be a lot more accustomed to things like that, or experienced, or working in certain fields where they do things like this, and they may be more confident or more equipped as well, actually.
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah. And I think that's the thing. It's got to be a collective discussion. And essentially, this is not kind of saying to people, go out and shout about the changes, and this is really comes down to like what is good for children and what's best for children. And I think there is so much that has happened in early years that has not necessarily done that, and we've had to implement that and use it. And I guess at some point, I feel personally that has to stop. Like we have to go back to like what is good for children. Why are we doing these things? And we have a strength in early years as a collective, and so do parents, in working together to be able to make, to make make those changes stop and make sure that any changes that are coming forward are much more positive and do have children at the centre of kind of, what they're for. And so those are just, those are some of the ways that can happen. I think other things that people could do if they didn't want to do those things, signing petitions are a good way. Usually I would say sign the government website petitions, because those are the ones that will lead, if there's enough signatures, they'll lead to a debate in Parliament. Other ones won't. So, I mean, you can still sign them, but those that have more strength in them. And then just again, really like feeding into consultations, particularly around the education select committee, that they often will question things that are being put out, and they'll do a balanced review of things. And so those are usually, good consultations to feed into. And you can do that as an individual. You can do that anonymously. You can do that as a collective. So it's kind of just being aware of those things. But I think, advocating for children this way is really, really important. Like I said before, because so many things have been put in place that have, not had the best interests of the children. Did have in the interim of kind of the people who put them together, but maybe they didn't have the experience or the knowledge of what's actually happening on the ground, and maybe the understanding of, what is really good for children versus kind of the agenda of outcomes, and that's it. It's kind of
versus outcomes based and focusing on money.
Rather
than children.
I mean, I think that is essentially it. And I do hope that with the new government, the outcomes based changes, the focus on that, but I don't know if that is the case.
But I guess, like you were saying about key times for advocacy, now really is a key time, because you mentioned earlier in relation to Parliament and the changes, and for instance there's been the recent change of Ofsted wording and gradings, which unfortunately has been as a result of a death of a head teacher, and then a lot of subsequent advocacy around this, and the sector has been quite vocal about this, all of the education sector. So with things changing now in government, with policies already, it's quite a pivotal time for more change to come, and therefore advocate now when we do have all of these things moving forward in some direction. They may not necessarily be the best outcome or exactly what we've hoped for, but actually if things are already kind of fluid, then there might be more opportunity for change.
100%. I think now is definitely the key for people to start engaging in advocacy in this way, because of the changing government. Policies are changing. Governments are much more open to making changes and listening, usually in the early days, because they're not relying on votes right now to win an election. They've got another 4 years till another election. So they kind of know that they can focus on quality work versus, keeping votes. So now is really, really important, definitely, in that. And I think, kind of what you said around the Ofsted wording, they obviously are making changes. And I think it's really important that people are sharing their views on this stuff, because sometimes with the best intentions, changes that are made don't always lead to better things. So, it's really important that people who on the ground experiencing these things and understand the impact of policies that are being put into place in the past. It's really important for anyone with those experiences to share those views, because again we go back to this, a lot of those decisions and policies are being put together often by people who've not been on the ground for a long time, if at all, and so their experience with that will maybe be a bit outdated or limited. So certainly. And if nothing else, like we owe it to ourselves and to the children that we work with to be their voices, because we have these processes in place that we can use, and so the more we use them, the more likely we are able to kind of influence and impact change in some way. It might be small, but it might not be. It might be big.
And I'm just thinking, when you're saying advocating for the voices of children, having children's voices heard through us, and families' voices, and sharing our voices. And it's just so important with the work that the Voice of Early Childhood does, hence the name. So I'm really glad that you have come on here talking about this, but from like a very practical sense as well, so that everyone working in the sector and families as well can really pick so many things out of this. All of the practical aspects that you talked about and that are in your article, it's really, really useful to have this. And when you mention writing to media and building up that community and networking, the Voice of Early Childhood is a space to be able to do that, hence why you're here as well. And not everyone may want to speak on a podcast or write an article, but actually speaking to someone or just writing in an email and saying, actually, this is a topic I feel really strongly about, and we've discussed this in our setting. We don't feel like we can or want to come on to talk about this, or not sure about writing an article, but please can we hear more about this? And then obviously there can be experts out there, other educators with experience, or researchers or academics or people from Parliament, hopefully maybe even coming on and discussing things like this.
Yeah, and I think, kind of on that note, people in Parliament, I'm sure it's very surprising how open they are to having these conversations and to people's views on this. So I think it's really key, for sure, and sharing information with parents so that they are fully aware of what's going on, and what their children are doing, and the impact of some of those things on them. So.
It's probably about really taking an active stance in one way or another, because if you don't reach out to a member of Parliament, and if you don't talk to parents, if you don't share kind of what's bothering you, what's perhaps not the best practice or the best policies, then there's no way of making a change. But actually, if you are active in some way, in one way or another, then at least that does start that process, like what we were saying earlier.
Definitely. And I think it's also, having the confidence to value ourselves and our experience. I think our voices matter just as much, and I think it is valuing that, which I think, maybe because of how early is viewed, often it kind of filters down, doesn't it, in terms of how we feel ourselves in some of those spaces, and actually that our voices should be there, and they're extremely important. Children's 5 to 7 years of their life are the most important, and so the work that people are doing in early years is key in supporting those children, and being their voice is really so important. And doing any of those things, reaching out to parents, speaking to the local MPs and councillors in the area, any of those things will help. And the more people that do that, the more likely there'll be a change for children. And I think also a change in how valued people who are working in early years are in those arenas.
That's a really good point.
There is a change in that. The fact that there is a minister for early years now, I mean, it's, maybe that is a sign that is going to be more valued, and people's voices will be heard a bit more, listened to a bit more, and it's worth using that. It's available to us. So
and I was just going to say as well, if, like I mentioned earlier, if people feel like there is something that they want to share, please do reach out to the Voice of Early Childhood, and then we can kind of bring up these issues a little bit more in a more collective way. And I'm just looking at the article from Dr. Nathan Archer and Dr. Joe Alban Clark, who discussed advocacy earlier in the year, and they talk about collectivism, activism through collectivism, which is exactly what you were talking about, Donna, as well. So it's very much about coming together, and so many people are talking about this, and it's just the most vital thing to be able to stand as one in the sector, because if people are coming to the government, to officials, to Parliament, with various ideas or how we can get there, or almost even conflicting messages, or the language that we're using is not consistent, then we're not going to be taken as seriously, like I mentioned earlier. So that collectivism is really, really important.
I mean, definitely 100%, because it needs to be a collective approach, and cohesive for sure, to be taken seriously.
Yeah. Well, thank you very, very much for sharing all of your experiences, your knowledge, your kind of key takeaways, practical tips as well. For everybody who's listening, now, as we said, now is a really key time for our voices to be heard because of all of the kind of things happening in the UK government right now. So do have a look at Donna's article. Note down some of the things that you feel like you could start making a difference to today, some of the things that you can start taking, those actions, those practical things, and start kind of making that begin that process, start the ball rolling, because that's the most important thing. We can often dwell on things and reflect and think, oh, this needs changing. I'm not too sure about this. But actually, if we just take a first step, then that will start to shift and things will start to happen. So yeah, thank you very much, Donna, for joining. It's been great to have you on. So I'll just mention some of the articles that I mentioned earlier. So if listeners enjoyed this episode, you also might enjoy reading and listening to the episode from Dr. Nathan Archer and Dr. Joe Alban Clark that I mentioned just now, Advocacy, Agency and Rights in Early Childhood, and also David Meacham's article and podcast episode on what's the problem with the reception baseline assessment. So the links are in the episode descriptions. They're obviously very much also based in advocacy as well. So thank you for Donna again for coming on. It's been brilliant to have, like I keep saying, all those practical things that we can take away. And I'm sure we'll hear from you again. And thank you to all of the listeners and viewers.